Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which is again in our Polishing the Classics series, a series in which we look at classic games and discover new ideas, new resources by analysing them with engines. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, and this time we are going to have a look at a very famous game between José Raúl Capablanca and Vyacheslav Ragozin, played at the Moscow International in 1936. It's a classic endgame in which Capablanca displayed amazing technique. And I wasn't really expecting to discover very much by analysing with engines, but actually they showed a completely different way of realising the advantage. And, well, along the way, by looking at the games that they played, I learned an awful lot about rook endings. So I thought I'd want to share that with you. What we'll do first of all, though, we'll start with how Capablanca did it and just see exactly how good that was. And so this is the position after 32 moves. Capablanca has won a pawn after Ragozin played his favourite Ragozin variation in the Nimzo-Indian. And the question is, how are you going to convert it? And now there's a famous story, possibly apocryphal, but about Capablanca, that during one of his games he walked past two strong players analysing an endgame, considering many complicated variations, and barely pausing he just remarked, this piece should go here, that piece should go there, and just walked on. In other words, navigating an endgame by formulating not necessarily a plan, but more a desired piece structure, rather than calculating long variations. And then normally, after citing this story, you show this game, because it really fits the principle of the story beautifully. So in this position, just as the first step of realising his extra passed a-pawn, Capablanca steered for a strong, actually more or less impregnable centralised piece setup, with the rook coming to c3, the knight coming to d4, and the pawns to b4 and f4, and then the king to e3. It's a really harmonious constellation of pieces, and it protects and attacks, an impressive number of central and wing squares. So, for example, we're protecting b5, c5, c6, e6, f5, e5. We're really exerting great control. And the result was a classic endgame, with just one really startling moment that, I saw pointed out recently by GM Carsten Müller in a recent endgame book. So let's have a look at how Capablanca did it then. So knight d4 was played to start off with, rook b7. And now, notice that Capablanca didn't play knight takes e6 check. He just played, which would have transposed to a rook ending and also damaged black's pawn structure. He just played b4. We'll focus on that moment a bit later. But b4 played, bishop d7, f4, king e7, king f2, rook a7, rook c3. Nice square for the rook, defending the a3 pawn whilst attacking the c7 pawn. And the rook has also got possibilities to give an annoying check to the black king, or even to go further and attack the black g-pawn. So very flexible piece. King to d6, rook to d3. Capablanca liked to, just to ask the question of black. It doesn't cost white anything to do that, and you never know, it might provoke a weird reaction. In this position, probably not so likely. Black doesn't really have that many moves to the king, but always possible. King e3, rook a4, rook c3. So Capablanca's achieved his desired structure, and he used his strength, his advantage to sort of show black that he could repeat it at will. And now Capablanca had to find the next stage of the realisation. And it suddenly struck me, actually. I mean, I've often remarked on AlphaZero's tendency, and you see that now in all the strong modern engines like Lila Zero and Stockfish, to secure just a series of good outposts or squares for its pieces, and then its initial way of trying to convert or increase its advantage is to just shuffle the pieces around on those outposts. So, and what you actually see is that this is what Capablanca actually does in this position, because moving from a rook c3, knight d4, king e3 structure Capablanca's going to try and put the king to d4, going to try and put the rook over to e3, and the knight is going to come to c3. And you're going to see what that's going to make, but the whole idea of this, having especially the king on d4 and the knight on c3, is that this makes it easier to advance these queenside pawns. And that's definitely one of the ways in which white can convert its advantage. Just advance these queenside pawns, make the most of the passed a pawn and the queenside pawn majority. So knight e2 played, which is not at all obvious. g6, rook d3 check, king e6, and king d4. And this is incredibly logical. However, it's also a huge tactical blunder, which is quite surprising. But Ragozin, I guess, just a little depressed about how things were going. He just played the move rook a6. But in actual fact, bishop b5, rook e3 check, king d6 is extremely unpleasant for white. Because bishop takes e2 followed by rook takes a3 is threatened, and also, I hope you can spot it, c5 check as well. And this pin along the fourth rank is very, very crucial. Actually, black's doing absolutely fine. Actually, white's probably got to be a little bit careful there just to find a good, accurate way of avoiding these problems. So actually a huge tactical error there, and well, we'll talk about that a little bit as well later. But after rook a6, then rook e3 check, king d6, knight c3, and there Capablanca's shuffled its pieces around, as we said, and is now ready to advance b5 and a4. Yeah, I mean, the knight covers those squares beautifully, the king stops c5, and the rook is actually preventing the black rook from activating itself on the e-file, and also possibly looking to invade on the 6th or the 7th rank if it gets the chance. So f5 played, b5, and king c4, king b4. We're now ready to come along with, well, actually either a4 to a5, or even the annoying move rook d3 check, chasing the king away, and then we can play a4 and even king c5 into c6, for example. So c5 played by Ragozin, all a bit of desperation, really. Rook d3, and now, yeah, I mean, you just see how beautifully Capablanca's done this. The white piece is beautifully active, and yeah, I mean, it's apart from that one blemish, I mean, it's a very smooth performance, very smooth technical performance. You couldn't really wish for much more. I'd be, incredibly proud of playing a game like that. So that was how Capablanca did it. Now, you'll maybe, just with a few of the comments I made, you'll sort of notice a few interesting things there. I mean, first of all, in this position, after knight d4, rook b7, Capablanca didn't take the chance to go into the pure rook endgame, even though he could have done it and damaged black's pawn structure. In actual fact, well, throughout that ending, there was never a moment, except by accident, where Capablanca offered the transposition into the pure rook ending. However, playing all my engine games, they were just offering transpositions into rook endings all over the place. I mean, it was really quite striking, and it wasn't even a case of taking the bishop there. I mean, all of my engines after knight d4 wanted to play bishop d7 as black, and then yeah, the next move was knight c6. So really just offering that, and it wasn't just with an evaluation of +1, +1.5. It was plus 3.5, +4, +5. Rapidly going up to +7 or 8. And it wasn't clear to me why this pure rook ending was so good. And so, it intrigued me, and, it also reminded me just a little of the final game of the World Championship between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. I mean, Jan made a terrible blunder, which in principle allowed a mating attack, but actually Magnus turned that winning attack into a winning rook endgame, which he proceeded to win with an ease that seemed pretty freakish to me. So, the idea of being able to repeat that flawless technique, that was very alluring. But clearly needed to put some work into it. So just what we're going to have a look. We're going to have a look at a couple of positions, a couple of engine games in which we got a transposition to a rook endgame, and then we'll try and understand what makes them so good for white. I mean, just one thing that I think that you can say just to start off with is that Obviously rook endings have got their own peculiarities, but they are, quite clean endgames. You've only got pieces that move along files, nothing along diagonals. And, you saw, how Capablanca, whilst seemingly making a very smooth technical performance, just missed something with a diagonal attack, and really due to the number of pieces on the board. So obviously the idea of transposing to a cleaner endgame, with fewer piece movements to consider, that is quite attractive as well. Just a case, obviously, of assessing it properly. So let's have a look at one of my engine games here. So after knight d4, bishop d7 was being played by my engines. Knight c6, rook b7. Again, you can see black not immediately going for that rook ending. So obviously, just as black, the engines are thinking, not too happy with it. Knight e5, bishop b5, again avoiding that exchange. Rook c5, f6, knight c6. And now, well, there's various threats coming in, but clearly the engines decided that knight had to be removed. Takes, king d7, and rook c3. And so this was the first position which I... there was one game with my engines there, with this one, and then afterwards I just ran lots and lots of games from this position. And, what makes this position such a clear win? And I think there are three quality factors, I think you'd say, and they're maybe not, immediately noticeable, but if you can become sort of sensitive to them, attuned to them, then I think, it's going to just aid your rook endgames enormously. So first of all, it's the rook's ability to anchor both the queen side and the king side. And what I mean by that is that it's this rook's ability to defend both the queen's side, and the king side from one single point. The point about an endgame is that you need to involve all of your pieces. So, white has to get this king involved and move it up the board. But obviously, when you do move it up the board, you leave behind, the home that it was protecting the king, but that the king was also protecting. So there's always likely to become counterplay there. So if you can just protect your, your king side very easily, with your rook, then that just leaves the king free. And actually, the third rank is absolutely beautiful for that purpose. We've got the rook, which is defending the a3 pawn this way, but it can also move along to f3, or it can move to g3 and defend f2 or g2 as necessary. And as a little bonus, it's also probably gaining a tempo by attacking the black king side pawns. So actually, the white king side is very safe, the queen side is very safe, and even when defending, the rook is very active. That's a huge quality factor. Secondly, the rook's got this ability, and if you haven't seen the video we did on the game Smyslov against Konstantinopolski, then do take a look, because it's very, very similar to this one. Again, the rook can come to the king side, attack the black king side pawns, and force those pawns to move forwards. Why is that good? It creates holes in the structure. Now, you could argue it's got holes already, and that is absolutely true, but they're very, very far away from the white king. If you can attack the pawns, force them to move forwards, then that's a much closer target for the white king, which just makes the attack quicker. And then finally, and it really fits into the power of this rook along the third rank, white's got enormous flexibility in choosing targets on either side of the board, and this I just hadn't realised until I played through some of my engine games. You have the feeling really that Capablanca's plan was pretty much queenside oriented. He was really looking just to advance those pawns, which is perfectly logical. But looking at my engine games, what you're going to see is that white's got the possibility to give a little check from the d3 square, and then the king's got to make a decision. It's either going to move to the queen side or to the king side. And what you were noticing was that my engines were actually really deciding where the king was going to go based on that. So, if the king goes to the king side, then this king was coming all the way over here and trying to invade in here and support these pawns. If the king went to the queen side, then the king was, coming in here and trying to attack the pawns. And you're actually going to see that these movements take part a few times. You do a check, the king moves over to the king side, the white king goes to the queen side, the black king runs over to try and stop it, and the white king goes over to the king side. It's that enormous flexibility. So the winning plan for white in this position is not just about advancing those pawns. It can also be about the king invading on the king side. And, well, it's just like, a penalty taker waiting where the keeper dives, before placing the ball. It's very, very similar to this. So let's have a look at one of these games. So G5 was one idea that my engines were making. Just putting that pawn on a protected square. Rook G3 was going to come in anyway, so might as well put it there. So next up, G4 from white, Rook B5 and Rook F3. And yeah, G4, a very common move in pretty much well, in an awful lot of those endings. What's happened here? What's so good about this? Well, look how beautifully placed the rook is. Actually, it's defending F2, H3, and A3. Pretty much every weakness in white's position. And as a nice bonus, it's attacking F6. And it's also gained an extra little outpost on F5. So, and actually that would also give it the possibility to maybe to move to A5 as well at some stage. So yeah, you're setting up this nice interconnection of outposts. But the most important thing is that this rook is anchoring queenside and kingside. No danger there at all, and that's going to free the king to come in now. Feels quite slow often all these endgames, but that is the nature of endgames, that you are often able to sort of nail the position down, so that it doesn't matter how much time black's got. Black doesn't have the power in order to put any extra pressure. In an endgame, in a middle game, you'd maybe have two rooks and you could double up against this one. But here you've only got one rook. It's protected by one rook, nothing to be done. So King E2. H5, just trying to open things up, and now nice little shift here. So Rook C3, King D6, and now King E3. Now what's happened there? Well, when white went Rook F3, that brought the king over to the king side. So white's initial reaction was to come in on the queen side. However, black's creating a little bit of kingside counterplay, also loosening the kingside pawns. So white decides to switch a little bit and go Rook C3, attack the pawn on D6. The king comes over to the queen side, and now the king is coming over to the king side. So now white's saying, okay, I'm not going to go to the queen side, I'm just going to invade here and attack the pawn on F6. Again, this beautiful flexibility, and really, again, something that hadn't really occurred to me when watching the Capablanca game. And yet, we saw how often in this position, Capablanca was, moving its rook to C3, to D3. Just, I think, really just, I was just seeing it as a show of strength. I can repeat moves. But I think it was also, very much part of this. Capablanca had realised how vulnerable the king was to attack, and that it might be possible to chase it back. For example, after Rook C3, maybe black might go to D8. Which would again, probably give white a lot nicer chances of moving to the king side, because the king's not in there in the centre, fighting for territory. So I think probably, this wasn't just repeating moves from a position of strength. It was also a question of doing what my engines are doing, which is trying to force the king to commit. And the interesting thing about it is that within the space of 3 or 4 moves, just reacting a little bit to a few changes in the position, white's first of all had the plan of drag the black king to the king side and come in through the queen side, and now it's drag the king to the queen side and come in through the king side. So H4 played. Yeah, always a decision here. If you go HG, then you maybe get the H file for play. But if you go H4, then you're going to tie down the H3 pawn, which might give you some counterplay later. Of course, though, with the rook on C3 here, again, it's doing this beautiful job of defending A3 and also defending H3. So there really is no danger at all. So King E4 and now Rook B5. So we've tried to get in through the king side, and black's blocked it. But of course, black's had to commit the rook to well, a slightly odd square. B5. It's sort of in the path of these pawns. If this one moves, we'll gain a tempo. But what does white do? You might be able to guess this. Rook f3, king e6, whoop, and now king d4. You know, beautiful play. This was from Leela. I thought it was very typical indeed. So, you know, blacks put up an obstacle to invading through the king side. Okay, so we drag the black king over to the king side again and now go to the queen side. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because the king's coming to the queen side and we're just gaining tempi against the rook here. Rook b6, king c5. In we go. So, yeah, we're now going to go a4, b5, a5 if black does nothing. So black says, okay, got to move that king over to the queen side now. Hold back the white king and maybe I can check the white king away or get the rook active somehow. So a4, you know, let's just take that opportunity to advance the pawn. King d5. And, well, actually, what is white threatening? Well, how about king e4 to f5, switching back to the king side now that black's king has gone to the queen side. So rook e6, no black place to stop that. a5, rook e5, check king d4. And indeed, black has now managed to stop the white king from invading on the king side. But there's a little matter of the pawn on f6, and of course these queenside pawns are running. Well, this rook can easily come to a3 and support the pawn to queen. You know, that could be really dangerous. So rook e6, b5, king c8. I mean, the pawn was threatening to come through, so the king has to now protect it. And now what do we do? King's gone over to the queen side. Of course, what we're doing is we're going rook e3, rook d6, king e4, and now the king's moving into f5. And rook d2, rook f3, again anchoring beautifully. Pawns on f2 and h3 are beautifully defended. Rook b2. Now, of course, you know, these queenside pawns have moved forward, so they're more vulnerable. But of course, you know, well, these kingside pawns here have been abandoned by the black king, so these are just as vulnerable, and there's three of them. And again, you see this lovely anchoring of the pieces. The rook here defending a5 and f2. And, well, if you go rook b3, I can go f3 to block, and then just come round and grab some pawns. So, yeah, after king b7, king f6, the king took on g5, and, well, this engine game didn't last very much longer. This was Leela, 40B network, the big network, killing my network card, my graphics card, rather, against Dragon 2.6. So, I mean, I think this was a beautiful exposition of everything that that white has in this position, and you saw how clean and easy it was. You know, once you got that basic idea in the ending, which was you know, anchor the rook, defend against any threats, open up the kingside pawns, bring them closer, bring the holes closer to the king, and then be flexible in your realization. You know, it's not a question of just running to your passed pawn and pushing it forwards. It's you know, you've got targets all over the board. You've got flexibility. You can, you know, checks, as always in rook endings. Checks, you know, we talked about them in Smyslov, Konstantinopolsky as a defensive maneuver, but it's also an aggressive maneuver to force the opponent's limited forces to make a decision, and then, you know, maybe loosen up a wing so that you can go there. So, you know, I thought this was just incredibly instructive, quite incredible end game, really. You know, just the technique of the engines is just unbelievable. And well, we saw. Just have a look at a second example. You know, after knight d4 and rook b7, and you know, again, you know, Capablanca very careful to keep rook and knight versus rook and bishop on. But my engines, you know, were just what, knight e6. There we are. Thanks very much. And you'll just see exactly the same themes. b4, king e7, king f1, king d7, king e2, rook b8, king e3. Interesting moment here. Rook f8. So f3 and rook a8, and black's idea, I mean, it wasn't actually necessary to play f3, but black's idea was to well, force the pawn to f3, and then the white rook, when it comes to c3, it can't get over to g3 to attack the pawn on g7. So, you know, that's quite yeah, quite sophisticated and quite an interesting idea there. Black doesn't have the power to to keep that going for forever. But it's shows the right spirit, certainly. So rook a6, king e4, king d6. Now this was a game Koi Visto 7.9 against Stockfish on my 94 thread machine, and Koi Visto shows beautiful technique as well. I mean, I will say that every single one of these games that I played with the engines from move 33 onwards ended in a win for white. So you can see how clear it is. But Koi Visto played rook d3, king e7. Now what do you think? That's right, king d4. The king's been forced to the king side, so let's just go over to the queen side. King d8 played, king c5 check, king c8. Well, now that the king's been forced over there, king b7, covering the a pawn. I'm sure you can guess what happened. Yep, the king comes back over to the king side. And of course this move f4 is very nice. It opens up the third rank again so that the rook can attack the g7 pawn. Rook d6, king e4, rook c6, rook g3. Rook c2. Again you see this rook on g3 anchoring g2 and a3. Rook g7, rook e2, king d4, g3, rook g5, rook h5, and it wasn't a problem for Koi Visto there. I mean, I think this is so instructive, I think just if you become sensitive to those quality factors about okay, what have I got in this position? Ooh, I can defend my king and king side and queen side in the just very, very efficiently. That will free my king to come in. I can force weaknesses. I know that I have to be flexible to play on both wings. I think you can just turn this sort of position into pretty much routine, really. Whereas I think Capablanca's way of winning was also very good, also very secure, but actually, well, as we saw, just a little bit the risk of little unexpected little things happening was higher, whereas here nothing unexpected is happening. What was also interesting, I tried various positions where, for example, the rook wasn't on b7 but it was on a2, for example, and still the engines were doing exactly the same plan, still with a big evaluation, +3 +4, and it took a little bit longer to organize, but the same idea of we can just defend the king side from one square, bring the king in wherever you want to be. Either I'm invading through the king side, I'm using my pawns to break it up, or I'm heading over to the queen side. It didn't really matter. It was just pretty much the same thing. And I tried again all sorts of positions where this is a great thing about the engines, right? I mean, you just say, okay, well, try this position with a pawn on b6, or try it with a pawn on a7, or whatever. But still, the basic plan was always there, and that basic strength in the white position. The evaluations went up and down a little bit, but still, those basic quality factors, the flexibility along the third rank, the ability to anchor both sides with one piece, and therefore the ability to be completely free with the king, and really decide whether to go right or left. That's that's just really the big quality factors, and I think those are the factors that are giving contributing towards a +3 or a +4. And I think another very good example of this sort of thing is the famous last game of the Alekhine-Capablanca World Championship match. Where Capablanca defended like an absolute wizard, but Alekhine demonstrated all these themes again. Being flexible enough, with a very flexible rook to be able to bring the king to the queen side or to the king side. So there we are. I hope that helped. I certainly felt it made some things very clear to me, and I think the ability to transform an advantage into a pure rook endgame. It's a very, very big skill here. So there we are. I just wanted to say thank you first of all to all of the subscribers who've joined in the last few days. Welcome, and I hope you keep on enjoying the channel. If there's anyone new, well, why not subscribe too, or certainly give a like to this video, or even take a look at the Silicon Road to Chess Improvement, my new book, which has got, well, lots of analysis and thoughts and reflections like this, and I think lots of tips for improving your chess, and also a big section on how to train with engines and get the most out of it, and actually how to run engine games like this to help you yeah, to help you get to the essence of positions. And well, I certainly hope that these videos, you know, really show the power of this, because frankly, this is the only way I prepare nowadays. But okay, you know, thanks very much for watching, and yeah, hope to see you at the next video.